Good. Okay. Well, that's a good few people connected. So welcome, everybody. Thank you very much for taking an hour out of your day today to hear about the new version of the Scrum Guides. Very excited to be joined by two of my colleagues here. So welcome, Paul and Jeff. How are you doing, guys? You all right?
Yeah, pretty good. Pretty pleased to be talking about this stuff.
Great.
Yeah, likewise.
Good stuff.
Glad to be here, Duncan.
Great. Okay. So on we go. So Scrum Guide 2020. Just a quick note, this session will be recorded. This is the agenda for the day. We're going to firstly briefly run through what's changed. Me, Jeff and Paul will have a bit of a chat about what we make of it. We'll then have some time for questions, regular sort of intervals throughout the questions, throughout the sort of webinar. Best way to do that, if you have questions in Zoom, you'll find a Q&A feature. Type in your questions as they occur to you. So as we're sort of talking, if you have a question, type it in as soon as it occurs to you. That way, when we get to the Q&A, we'll be able to dive straight in and hear from your questions. After that, we're going to look into see if you need to change anything. The Scrum Guide has changed. Maybe you're doing Scrum. You want to know if you need to sort of make any radical changes. So we'll sort of talk about that. Another sort of slot for Q&A. And then we'll wrap things up by seeing if this presents any opportunities, you know, given the relative, I guess, sort of lightening up of the guide. We've sort of ditched a bunch of pages. It's become a little bit less prescriptive. We'll see if this opens up any opportunities. Maybe you're not doing software. Maybe you're not doing something that was constrained before. So we'll get a chance to delve into that. Good. So let's dive straight in then. So what's changed? Let's just run through the sort of key headline changes. First of all, it's become quite a bit less prescriptive. We've knocked off several pages. It's come down to 13 pages. Some of the advice has been become sort of less strong. Chaps, what are your main impressions? What have you sort of seen sort of taken out that grabbed your attention?
Yeah, so I think first of all, there's subtle word changes that have sort of made it a little bit less prescriptive. So, for example, the Scrum Master is no longer a servant leader. It talks about them as a true leader. So I'm not sure whether that makes it more ambiguous or less ambiguous, yes. But it's certainly a change. And I think what that to me illustrates is, again, it's about this prescriptiveness. Servant leadership is just one way of leading a team. And what the Scrum Guide is now saying is that it's up to you to determine how you fulfill those accountabilities. Servant leadership may be, still something you want to consider, but there may be different scenarios that a different leadership might be appropriate, and that's for you to determine for yourself.
Yeah, it was always a bit of a loaded term, I felt, sort of servant leadership. So we've sort of relaxed that a little bit, opened it up to allow you to sort of find your own leadership style. I think one of the things I quite like is the removal of specific advice, such as the 3 daily Scrum questions. Yesterday I did this, today I plan to do this, I have no impediments. All traces of that have been removed. Similarly, things around, sort of the fact that you have to have a retrospective item in the sprint backlog for next time. Those sorts of mechanical things that sometimes, get into mechanical Scrum have been taken out. Again, allowing more freedom to allow you to do Scrum the way that you might want to do it.
Yeah, I think, there's some strengths to this in terms of, makes it more applicable for different sort of scenarios. I think it certainly helps it move beyond software. But I think also the downside is because it is less prescriptive, it makes it a little bit harder for people to know where to get started as well. No longer telling you that you need to do burn down charts and estimates and velocity. So so it can, maybe that makes it a little bit more confusing.
Yeah, absolutely. What else have we got then? So we've taken away the development team. They're gone. We now just have a Scrum team building a product. What do you think about that, Jeff?
One of my favourite parts, actually, Duncan. I think it has changed. I mean, Scrum is still Scrum, right? So I really like this change. It's a lot leaner, a lot lighter. But one of my favourite changes was getting rid of that dev team that was that team within a team. And whenever I'm teaching Scrum, I'm always pushing the fact that it's a team sport. We're all in this together. We're all trying to deliver value for our customers. And that concept of having a Scrum team and then a dev team within it always felt just a little bit awkward for me. And it's a good way of trying to get rid of that us and them feeling. I like it.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm looking forward in training courses not to have that sort of awkward debate about who's accountable for delivering the value. Is it the development team? Is it the product owner? Is it the whole team together? It now is just everybody. Everybody is jointly accountable for delivering value, which I think is a positive move. Good. Next up then, excitedly, we got this new element then, the product goal. What, anyone like to take a stab at explaining what a product goal is?
Well, yeah. So I think I think at Agility Mind, when we've sort of been helping Scrum teams, we've always spoken about the importance of a vision and having a direction. And so the product goal is, is something that should be closely associated with your product backlog, and particularly the Scrum Guide says it is part of your product backlog. But it's the thing that gives sort of focus and direction to where you're going. So I think it's it's about sort of reinforcing what is known as the Highlander rule, isn't it? If you've got one product, you should be have one product owner, one product vision, one strategy. You're trying to achieve one outcome, so I think that's a great advantage. Jeff, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so I like this. We've got folks from Waitrose and John Lewis on the call, I know, and they'll be familiar with me going on about sprint goal all the time and how important it is to give the team that focus for each sprint. And I feel that if you scale it up and then you've got the product goal, you've got a tangible kind of representation of that vision, as you talked about earlier on, Paul. So I think it's a good thing. I think it's always been there. I don't think it would change the way that I would teach Scrum, but it just gives it more tangibility. It's a definite thing now, which is it's good to recognise it.
I think in many ways it formalizes what a lot of people were doing anyway. If you're using Scrum well, product goal for me is a little bit like a near-term vision. I think I don't know about if in fact we do quite regularly when we're sort of talking about to clients about making plans for the next quarter perhaps, or getting teams to work together. We'd always say, well, let's describe the vision for the 3 months, 4 months from now, the next release, whenever that might be. I don't think anyone ever used the term product goal before, or maybe they did, but it wasn't a recognized term. But I think it's just a kind of a formalization of something that was good practice beforehand.
Yeah, and this seems to be sorry.
But I was just going to say, it brings us onto the sort of the structure of the rest of the artifact. So there was, as you say, there was always a sprint goal, for the sprint. There was always a definition of done associated with the increment. The product goal is a bit like the same thing for the product backlog. The goal for the next 3, 4, 5 sprints is this high level objective.
So, and I think certainly with each of these commitments, there seems to be a greater emphasis on almost like a singularity, isn't it? So you've got only a single product goal, so you're only trying to achieve one thing at a time. But also, one thing that hasn't changed is only having a single sprint goal, and your definition of done and the increments. That again sort of brings that singular focus on what you're trying to achieve.
Yeah, absolutely. Good. Next up, then we got another sort of terminology change there. So servant leaders are out, and similarly, self-organizing teams are now self-managing. This is probably the most maybe arcane sort of change. There's nothing you immediately have to do differently. There's no sort of difference in the agenda to any of the events arising from this. What do we think about this?
Yeah, I think this is really about sort of lifting up the accountabilities of the Scrum team. And I think previously the self-organization was referred to as the development team. And I think now it's, we've got just the Scrum team. It's kind of saying, well, and self-organizing was, kind of like what you do on the daily Scrums, but the self-managing sort of is that next level of accountability, isn't it? It's, taking ownership of the delivery and making sure that you're sort of making plans for yourself and executing on those plans.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I guess the intent behind this sort of tweak in the language here is, as you say, emphasizing the sort of focus on the Scrum team rather than just the self-organizing development team who would sort of do that sort of thing. So the whole Scrum team, including the product owner and the Scrum team, are sort of choosing how and when or what to work on. So
Yeah.
emphasizing those sorts of elements. Yeah.
And I think in the Scrum Master classes that we've already been teaching, there are certain elements of self-managing that I think often we often teach, but I don't think they're fully under. I think this can be underappreciated. So the idea of self-selecting the team members, for example, that is more self-managing than self-organizing.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I'll be honest here. When I first read that, I just thought there was, self-organizing, self-managing, and I would use those interchangeably. And I couldn't really see the point. And now, the more I've thought about it and the more I've read, that you're absolutely right. The self-managing implies that higher level of control, not only just the who and how we're going to work on, but what we're going to work on as well. Because of course now we're not talking about a development team within a Scrum team. We are just talking about the Scrum team, and it's that higher level of self-management, self-explanatory, isn't it? But I think it is a worthwhile change. But at first I needed convincing, I have to admit.
Absolutely. Good. Well, it's a couple of changes left then. This is quite an interesting one next. So the traditional way of doing sprint planning is there to solve two major problems. What are we going to build and how are we going to build it? We've added in a third question now. Why? Why are we doing it? And this relates to the product goal and the sprint goal, the blend of those two things are together. So I think this is actually quite an interesting one. I think it's going to prompt people to think about trying to make their sprint plannings a bit more, maybe a bit more engaging, a bit less of a tedious Jira ticket fest.
Yeah, I think this is the Simon Sinek change, isn't it? The start with why approach, and I think one of the advantages, again, it comes back to sort of building on that focus. And one of the challenges lots of teams have when they're trying to sort of create unity as a team and sort of work together is, if the sprint is like a tapas menu of just random things, but if you start off with a single why, what is the business objective we're trying to achieve, and then formulate the sprint goal, then that naturally means that everything else sort of hangs together in a sensible way.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's the easiest thing to lose sight of sometimes, the why, isn't it? You can get sort of stuck down in the weeds of what and how to do it, and you can lose sight of why are we doing this again, and has the world changed, is it still relevant? It's just worth having in there to just keep touching base that you're on the right track, and it's a good thing to do.
Yeah, absolutely. Good. And then finally, then, I think a little bit sort of related to the first point about it being less prescriptive. One of those, I think the key points of the Scrum Guide is the simplification of the language, in particular, removing all sort of references and traces of software and software product delivery. Of course, well, product is still in there, very much so. It's got a product backlog and a product owner, but any references to IT terms like testing, system design, requirements, those sorts of terms, that's been taken out to allow a bit more breadth and sort of freedom to manage the sort of complex products that you might be building. So you're no longer constrained to those IT-based terms. What do we think about the idea of using Scrum for non-IT things?
Yeah, I think, certainly Agility Mind, we've worked with quite a few non-IT teams. Last year I worked with e-commerce marketing teams, and I think removing some of the techie language is beneficial. And there's more and more case studies now of non-software teams trying to use Scrum. I think in the early days there was always the Scrum for Schools sort of variation, but now lots of marketing teams, like I mentioned, there's anything where you want to build something in a complex domain, Scrum can be really useful.
Good. Well, I think that's enough whittering on from us. I think we can get on to some questions now from the audience. We've got Jess here from our events team, and she's going to sort of read out some of the questions for us. What have we got there so far, Jess? Do we have many questions in the Q&A?
Yeah, we have a couple at the moment. So the first question is, who is accountable for setting the product goal? Is it the product owner or the whole Scrum team?
Interesting. Our first sort of sergeant's exam type question. Let's skip over to the guide itself. So I think the product goal is attached to the product backlog. So let's sort of bring that up there. And there we go. What do we think, guys? Who's in charge of the product goal?
So this is about the difference between accountability versus who actually does the work. So I think clearly the product owner has the accountability for the product backlog, and therefore it makes sense that they have the accountability for that product goal as well. The question is should they just lock themselves in a room and come up with a really amazing vision, goal, or is there a better way of doing it? And what is the actual practice that we need to think? Jeff, thoughts?
Well, I think so. I'd use the same rationale that we use a sprint goal, that is something that is negotiated and crafted between the entire team within a sprint to ensure they've got that focus, that buy-in, that understanding. And I think same for the product goal. Actually, I think it's an entire team collaboration. Definitely, the product owner brings an awful lot of knowledge, and as you say, that originally that vision. But I think it's something the whole team have to buy into and create together.
Yeah, I think there's definitely that sense of shared accountability for creating value. But on the other hand, I think it's important that each sort of accountability, as they're now called, they're not called roles anymore apparently, has a certain sort of responsibility. So the product owner still manages the product backlog. The product goal is in the product backlog. So I think the product owner is still very much accountable for making sure that the future state is well described. But of course, they would delegate as and where needed. If it's a small team with a small sort of backlog and relatively sort of manageable sort of goals, it probably would be the product owner doing most of the work. It could well be the case you got 6 or 7 teams all working on the same product with a shared product goal. In which case, the product owner is going to delegate quite a bit of that accountability and the actual work to the sort of members of those development teams. Good. Okay. Anything else in the Q&A, Jess?
Yep, so Claire has asked, has the term servant leadership been replaced with anything or removed entirely?
Sounds like one for you, Paul. You were talking about this earlier on.
Yeah, so servant leadership has definitely been removed, or the expression has been removed from the guide. And I think what this has been replaced by the expression true leader. And I think one of the challenges we always had with servant leadership was, what does it really mean? I had to previously dive back to Greenleaf's books written sort of 20, 30 years ago to sort of go on that journey. But I think true leadership is equally not well defined. But I think what that does do is tie back to that idea that the Scrum Guide is less prescriptive. So each of what was originally the roles are now the accountabilities. We have the accountabilities of the Scrum Master. And so what I think that the guide is now telling us is it's your job to fulfill those accountabilities, but we're not going to tell you how to do it. It's up to you to decide what the best way of serving your developers, your product owner, and the organization is. The fact that the words, the Scrum Master still serves the organization and the developers and etc. still exists, it implies there are still elements of that, but it's not, maybe it's, I think probably a good way of thinking about it is, it's an option and it's not the only way of leading.
Good stuff. Okay, any more, Jess?
Yeah, a couple more coming through, sorry. From Mark, what is your view that there's only been one product owner when multiple teams are working on the same product?
Oh yeah, I'll take this one then. So I think this has always been an age-old sort of debate, and one of the sort of things, if you ever want to pass a test in Scrum.org, it's a very sort of key one. You can't have multiple product owners for the same product. I guess the way I always think about this is, imagine you're running a business. There is always one person in charge of the business, whether it's 5 or 6 employees or 10,000 employees. There's one person who's accountable for maximizing the value of that business. And that's the logic that follows with the role of the product owner. If you've got a single team building a small product, have one product owner in charge. That all works very sort of straightforwardly, as very well documented. If you then add teams, if you have 3 or 4 or 5 or 10 or 20 teams, you still have one person in charge of the value and optimizing the value. It's just that role will scale. You will have to delegate a lot more. And in fact, I think with the latest version of the Scrum Guide, this emphasis on self-managing as a Scrum team as a whole gives a little bit more leeway for that. You can delegate lots more responsibilities. You don't necessarily, if you're the product owner for 10 teams, you're not going to be going to every single sprint planning session or every single review or retrospective, but you'll figure out a way to delegate responsibilities to members of the development team to make that happen. Good. Okay. What's next then, Jess?
Okay, so we have another question. Self-managing and self-organizing, is there any practical difference?
Anyone fancy that one?
Well,
practical difference. Yeah, Jeff, you were about to chip in.
No, I was going to say we kind of touched on it earlier on, and initially that was my response. Exactly the same. That was kind of, hang on, these words are very similar. I do think in retrospect that there is something there. Now we're talking about just one Scrum team. I think self-management is more appropriate. Something I'd read kind of suggested that when you said self-organizing and a team came up against an issue, they organize themselves around it and to sort of get past that particular blocker or whatever it was. Self-managing was even more empowering, that they would actually squash that blocker and overcome it. That was one of the thoughts behind what this wording change was all around, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, I think one of the challenges that Scrum teams often face is when they come into conflict, and and often a simple view of how we resolve conflict in the Scrum team is the Scrum Master's the servant leader. They should sort of wade in, split everyone up, take them aside, have some chats, be a neutral arbitrator. But I think the idea of this self-management sort of takes it to the level of, well, it's not just the job of the Scrum Master to help the team navigate conflict, but partly put the emphasis back on the team themselves to be able to say, well, you need to manage the conflict yourselves. And that's part of that self-management, I believe. So it's about taking the accountabilities up to the next level.
Good.
Yeah.
So I think very much a kind of a one to interpret. I think this one there's no specific, it's not as if you're exceeding a time box or your event is in the wrong sort of place or the wrong people are there. It's very much I think it's how you interpret sort of terms like self-organizing or self-managing are going to vary quite significantly. But maybe that sort of shift of emphasis is an opportunity to give thought to what it means to you. Maybe.
There's a nice comment in the chat there actually from one of the attendees. It says self-managing equals self-organizing plus self-directing.
Yeah, interesting. There's always
approval. I like it.
I think that might refer. There's always different levels of autonomy, isn't there? At a very sort of basic level, the team gets to decide what they do over the course of a sprint. A level above that, perhaps they have a bit of autonomy over their team composition. Little level above that, maybe they start to have more autonomy over what exactly they build. So self-organizing and self-managing have always been sort of things that you can build on and do more or less of, and it sort of relates back to how much autonomy you give to a team. Various sort of motivational factors related to that. But generally speaking, the more autonomy you have, the more empowered you feel, the happier you are, and maybe the more creative and productive you become. So I think many organizations struggle to sort of find that gap. How much autonomy can we give? Can we sort of legitimately give to a team? I think it's in that sort of area. Good. We should move on. What else have we got in the Q&A, Jess?
We have Alan asking, when will the PS1 and PS2 exams be updated with the changes to reflect the new Scrum Guide?
Great, that's a nice easy one. So the answer to that is your last opportunity to take the current 2017 version of the exam is the 9th of January. On the 10th, all the assessments will be shut down by scrum.org while they do the update. And then from the 11th, it will be based on the 2020 version of the Scrum Guide. Good.
Great, thank you. And we also have a question directed to Jeff. What do you think about the change from team members being referred to as team members before this release, and now they're back to being developers? This feels like a retrograde step to me and a legacy language, particularly when Scrum is now pitching into non-tech areas. Right,
I can see that's from Matt. Hi, Matt. Thanks very much. It's all Matt's fault that I'm sitting here today, actually. He started me off on the scrum.org journey years ago and convinced me to take that first PSM1 exam. So thank you for that, Matt. Yeah, I have to. I know we've talked about development teams and losing all the individual sort of roles within that, and they're all just called developers. You're right, but team members, I tend to agree with you. It does sound a bit more more in keeping with that non-software specific sort of focus. So I'm not here to protect the Scrum guide everywhere. I think I quite like it as team members. Developers does feel like a retrograde step to me too. I think I'd have to agree with you there. I'd be interested to see what Paul and Duncan think.
I think language and terminology is always a challenge where the Scrum Guide is used around the world. I think for many years, various different cultures really objected to the term backlog, for example, that had various unsavory connotations. I think whatever language you choose, whatever terminology you choose, it's going to be received and interpreted differently by different audiences. I think the term developers has previously been used in that sort of title before, and it simply just refers to anybody that's involved in doing any element of the work, whatever the work is. I think this change is simply intended to reinforce that. But I guess you're absolutely right to say developer is associated with software engineering, and that is a potential drawback. But I think, as with all these things, you've just got to interpret it as best you can. Good. Okay. Well, I reckon we should move on. I can see there's another couple of questions coming in, but what I suggest is we take a look at the next sort of section, and then those questions that are still in the Q&A, they'll still be there, and we'll get to them for the next sort of section. So, burning question then, I guess many of you are here because you're sort of seeing, there's been a change to the Scrum Guide. What do we need to do? Monday morning, do our job titles change? Do we have to reschedule any events? Are there any sort of major changes we need to make to our product roadmaps or our plans? We need to sort of tell our clients to do things differently. The main answer is no. You don't need to do anything immediate. Scrum is still Scrum. But I think there are various things that you might think about doing. If we sort of think about the sort of changes that we've just been through there, one of the big themes that the various sort of Scrum community sort of people, the sort of PSTs and the other sort of professionals that we sort of talk with, one of the big themes that sort of come through is that the 2020 guide simply makes the original intent more clear by sort of clearing out a bit of the clutter, simplifying a bit of the language, and so maybe it's an opportunity to sort of have a think about what these changes might mean for you. For example, the fact that the guide is now less prescriptive means, well, maybe you could think about being a bit less mechanical. What do we think about that? What kind of mechanical Scrum have you guys seen over the years that maybe the 2020 guide might be a good opportunity to tackle?
Yeah, so I think there's the popular phrase at the moment, isn't it, zombie Scrum? And I think one example is where we get to the sprint review and there's either nothing to show or there's no stakeholders to actually give any feedback. So we kind of, so some teams will still have the review and kudos to them for doing so. But what you've actually lost is the ability to apply that empirical process. And I think it's more what we have to do is remind ourselves that is the important part of Scrum, is that empirical cycle, rather than just the mechanics of making sure we do the set meetings. So without any working increments, without an increment, and without stakeholders to give feedback, the sprint review is no value.
Yeah, absolutely. What else could we think about then?
The daily Scrum is a good example there as well. They've, like I said, they've removed reference to the 3 questions. It sets out the objective of the daily Scrum with the sprint goal, etc. And I think that it's left to the team to organise themselves. I think it's better.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, there'll be hopefully less Scrum Masters pointing at individuals in their daily Scrums going, well, what did you do yesterday? And what are you going to do today? I think, that hopefully moves it back towards the intent.
I think there's probably a few Scrum Masters out there still sticking to the 2010 version of the guide. Good. What else have we got then? So I think one of the interesting things maybe is as we sort of talked a bit about before, that sometimes there was a gap between us and them, the developers and the product owner. This might be a good opportunity to think about that relationship. Think about how what happens. For example, halfway through a sprint, you're not quite on track. Is it a whole team discussion, or is it the product owner scowls at the development teams and says, "Ah, you guys are late again." Reinforcing this thing that it is a whole team, I think, is a interesting sort of improvement.
I think the other thing on that is there's still a lot of teams there that even when it was the development team as a sub team, even then there was organisations that still had the sub team of the development teams. They had the coders and the testers and the designers, and you got end up with 3 or 4 different teams within the development team within the Scrum team. So it's definitely about creating that flat structure within the Scrum team, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. So if people, as you say, if people are still having sub teams within the development team, that development team is long gone. Hopefully now we can at least focus on having a good relationship with the product owner.
Yeah, so it's one team, one set of accountabilities, isn't it, for delivering that value?
Yeah. Good. What next then? I really like this new product goal. I think it, as I sort of said before, it's a bit of a redescription of the sort of the advice that I would always give about having a pretty good medium-term vision. 3 months from now, this is what our product's going to be like. This is what we're all sort of getting, trying to get towards. And I think that's again a good opportunity to try to develop that sort of medium to long-term strategy.
Yeah, and I think part of this, I really like the Alice in Wonderland meme where she meets the Cheshire Cat and she says, "Well, I don't know which way to go," and he says, "Well, where are you trying to get to?" And she says, "I don't know." And he's like, "Well, it doesn't matter then." And your product goal is a little bit like that, isn't it? It's like without knowing where to go, then it doesn't really matter what you put on your product backlog. It's not going to make any difference. So I think it's really, really valuable.
Yeah, exactly. Good. What about the definition of done, Jeff? What do you think about this? How do you see definition of dones and the other sort of commitments working for teams at the moment?
So definition of done was in there before, as was sprint goal, but neither of them. This has given a home for both of them, and really put them in their place. They were sometimes people were saying, "Well, so is sprint goal, for example, definition of done? Are they other artifacts?" And you'd say, "No, actually, they're not classed as an artifact," but kind of, well, where do they sit? And I think this has really given them their rightful place.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it makes it a bit more elegant. I think elegant to sort of think about. Each artifact has a commitment associated with it. It now sort of seems to stack up and fit together a bit nicely, which is quite nice. Good.
There is also a change though, isn't there? Because I think previously it said that the definition of done was created by the development organization, and as part of that non-software sort of language, it's also now said that the Scrum team is accountable for creating the definition of done, rather than just saying the developers. So I think, but it's also a good reminder that if you've not reviewed your definition of done in some time in your retrospective, it's probably a good opportunity just to check in on your quality.
Yeah, absolutely. And similarly, this idea of sort of sprint goals, I think a lot of the sort of these changes here is just a good opportunity to see, well, what are we currently doing? I think the emphases that have been sort of placed with this new guide, the simplifications and I guess the sort of restatement of the theory, just gives you a bit of a chance to sort of step back and say, well, if we weren't even doing sprint goals before, they're now sort of very much front and center, a big part of the framework, slightly more so than they were before. Good opportunity to think about the intent behind them. I think one of the things about a sprint goal especially guards against that anti-pattern where you've got a Scrum team, but actually all 6 or 7 people are just working on their own thing. Each individual is working on their own sort of specific client projects, and maybe sort of each person has 2 or 3 things to get done that sprint. Some of the language in the Scrum guide now very much encourages whole team, not just whole team accountability, but whole team goals. The fact that a whole team really is trying to do the same thing within a sprint.
I think I've always thought that's really powerful. I'm glad to see it's got a rightful place there, as you say, an elegant sort of solution to where it fits into the framework. It's that for me, it's the sprint goal is the elevator pitch So I ask a team, what are you up to in this sprint? It's that one liner that gives me a real succinct answer of what they're aiming for, where they're trying to go. And I think the product goal would work as well, scaled up in the same way.
Good. Well, let's. I think we've already made the point about the assessment. So once again, if you haven't yet swatted up on product goals and these different sort of changes, you've got until the 9th of January to take the original version of the test. Good. So, any questions on anything there? Jess, do we have anything more in the Q&A?
We do. We can give this one to all of you. What is the biggest change that you've seen?
Good. Who wants to go first?
I think the biggest thing for me is probably the formalization of a product goal. And folks will say, well, what does that look like? Have you got any examples? As we've already had questions, who creates it and so on. I think that's perhaps for me one of the biggest changes. Good.
What about you, Paul?
Yeah, I think there's lots of really small changes. I think that the product goal is really, I think it's a substantial addition to it. I think but also I think one of the things I do like is the removal to reference some of the complementary practices out of the guide as well. So whilst it's been strengthened to focus on the core concepts, it has removed some of those other references. It doesn't mean that those other things like burn down charts and all those things are bad. It just means that more emphasis on those are optional extras, and the focus is really on the core of Scrum, that empirical process.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a few things. I think maybe one thing that one big change is that sort of change in the sort of team structure, that sort of highlighting the fact that it is just one core team. The development team as a distinct entity is gone. I think that's quite big. That is, in terms of the intent behind it and how where the accountabilities are. I think that if you the more I sort of think about that, that is quite a shift and quite a sort of fundamental change. So yeah, I'd either go for that or perhaps this sort of movement towards non-software. I think I've got to say 95% of all Scrum around the world almost certainly involves developers typing code. But I think that is again a big sort of shift, and it's been on the cards for many years. People are always talking about Scrum for non-IT applications. Now the guide formally sort of takes out IT entirely and says it's a framework for complex product delivery, not necessarily in the software domain.
Duncan, I'll give you just a frivolous example as well. One that I particularly like is team size. It's now 10 members or less.
Yeah,
no
lower limit.
I was always used to struggle. Is it 3 to 9? Is it 5 to 7? Is it 2 pizzas worth?
Yeah,
it was always tricky for me. 10 and less, that's simplified. I can remember that. So
I've got to say, as a trainer who teaches multiple certified classes, whether it's SAFe or Scrum or BCS Agile, each has a different set of numbers, and it's always a challenge as a trainer, right? Which number am I giving today? What number I have to tell people to memorize today? Actually, this doesn't change that. It's still just a different number. It's just, but slightly simpler. There's only one number, less, 10, usually less than 10. Not a rule, not a sort of upper limit, but just a bit of a guideline. If you find yourself
still small, though.
It is still small, yeah. Yeah. Good. Any more questions in the Q&A?
Yeah, we have one from Cyril, which would be quite good for you, Duncan. Does this mean that the SAFe will also need further updating to be in line with the new Scrum guide?
No, is the short answer to that. So Scaled Agile, who put together the Scaled Agile framework, they have their own interpretation of Scrum. The Scrum Master in SAFe and the sort of Scrum practices in SAFe are basically their sort of reinterpretation of it. So it's not aligned. It has different language. They call their sort of sprints iterations, and various different things are different. So I don't expect SAFe to be making any immediate changes, given that they were already slightly out of line. They weren't directly following the Scrum Guide in the first place. Good. What next?
Great. Got a question for Paul. So starting from scratch in a culture high in BUCA, any tips for guiding the team and the PO and how to structure the 90-day product goal?
Well, yeah. So, well, first of all, it doesn't have to be 90 days, but 90 days might be a reasonable amount of sort of duration for your product goal. That that would, if you're working in sort of quarters, of a year, the product cycle, that might be good. And the problem with VUCA, so that's volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and what's the A, Dunk? I've forgotten.
Oh, I knew you were going to ask me that. Ambiguity.
Ambiguity, yeah. So, I think it's probably fair to say most organisations are operating in this VUCA environment now. We've all had to pivot to a certain degree in order to make our organisations survive over the last sort of 6 to 12 months with things like COVID, remote working. Just the general acceleration of technology and user expectations as well. But the thing is you've still got to put a stake in the ground and say this is where we're heading. Part of the sort of mindset is, well, there's no point in creating a product goal for 5 years time. You're just not going to be able to, and nobody on this planet can crystal ball what is likely to be happening in 5 years time. Would we be all driving flying Teslas, sort of using Oculus Rifts to sort of zoom into our daily meetings? Who knows? But what we can do is we can have a reasonable idea of what is it we'd like to deliver over 3 to 6 months, or even a year, at the stretch. And so, and that's our target. But we also, need to make sure that our goals aren't cast in concrete either. And as soon as that goal is no longer required, it's no longer relevant, or has been achieved, then we should create new goals. Dunk, anything additional to add?
Maybe just one thing. So I think this is something that's covered in the PSPO-A class, the sort of advanced Scrum.org product owner class, and in particular in the section on the experimenter. So part of the role of the product owner, most of it day to day, right? What are the team going to work on for the next 2 to 3 sprints? Let's get the product backlog in shape. One of the things that's nice about the advanced class is it highlights some of the other stances required to be a really effective product owner, and one of those is the experimenter. Crafting some experiments, some short, sort of low risk data gathering exercises, or sort of things like product pages where there's a link, register your interest, those sorts of things. Those are the things that are likely to give rise to future product goals. Now that we've got a bit of validation that people want this, now that we've decided to invest in it, the goal for the next 90 days is to actually build it and try it out. Good. I can see we've got a few questions coming in thick and fast there, so we should probably rattle through a few more. Jess, what's coming up next?
Yeah, we'll stick with the product goal questions for the moment. So is product goal time bound, for example, for a quarter PI, or for the product development lifetime, perhaps years?
I think the short answer to that is no, but there is always only one. So you set a product goal, the team either delivers it or abandons it, and at which point you come up with a new one. So it's a bit like, say, right, this is where we're going. It can change. You don't necessarily always have to hit it, but it's always either delivered or replaced by the next goal. I think that's the mechanics there.
But I think in practicality, and relating back to the VUCA conversation that we've just had, product goal that's talking about something in 5 years' time isn't necessarily going to sort of create much context to your product backlog. And again, you probably wouldn't want to have a product backlog that is, covers 5 years worth of work either. So I think probably the rule of thumb is that if your product goal should give context to your product backlog, and so the two should be used to support each other.
Good stuff.
It's that North Star, isn't it? It gives that focus, that direction, but it's not immovable.
Great. So carrying on, is a product goal set in stone at the start of the project, like the sprint goal for a sprint, or can it be adapted throughout the life cycle of the product?
Jeff, do you want to take that one?
No, so I was just saying, I think anything that's set in stone worries me. It means that we're going to carry on doing nonsensical things, even when we know we shouldn't and we know better. So I don't think anything's set in stone. We're learning all the time. The world's evolving, and our understanding is evolving as well. So I think it's a great thing to have something to aim for. It's like I say, it's that North Star. This is where this product's going. But we're on a journey of discovery, and just as the product backlog emerges, that will change our view of what the product goal should be.
Yeah, I'd agree. Good. What's next then, Jess?
Comment from Mark. So, is the product backlog finished when the product goal is met?
Is the product backlog finished when the product goal is met? Well, no, I think Scrum is always intended for open-ended product delivery rather than fixed date projects management or project delivery. So the idea is that the product backlog is continuously evolving. When you meet the product goal, at that time, there's probably almost certainly another 50 or 100 items in the product backlog already for you to think of next. And if you're doing a good job as a product owner, you've already started to think about the next product goal as the culmination of the previous product goal is to be delivered.
Okay, we've got another one about the product goal again. The sprint goal, when the sprint goal becomes obsolete, the sprint is cancelled. What happens when the product goal becomes obsolete?
Paul, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, so when the sprint goal is obsolete, we do cancel the sprint, and and that raises the question: well, is the entire product obsolete? And if so, then I guess you would just stop work. But assuming your product is still viable, then what you would do is you would go immediately into sprint planning and start with a new sprint goal. If the product goal becomes obsolete, then it would make sense to stop, formulate a new product goal, and as the Scrum Guide says, the product goal is a part of the product backlog. It's the commitment for the product backlog. So you're probably going to want to refresh your product backlog according to that new goal. And so building on what Jeff had previously said, none of these things are set in stone. They should be continuously evolving as we discover new information.
Incidentally, if you're wondering where those 6 pages have gone in this trimmed down version of the Scrum Guide, a good half page, I think, went related to cancelling a sprint. So that's now down to a line and a half, whereas before it was a good half page of detail on when and how a sprint was cancelled. So that'd be something be worth going and checking up afterwards.
Cool.
Great, thank you. We have a question from Govinda. Given the senior members are PO and SM, is the delineation of the responsibilities key, or is the agreement required and an escalation mechanism required for disputes?
Interesting, yeah. So I think this is probably one of those questions that's around the fact that Scrum is a framework. So Scrum defines sort of certain accountabilities in the 3 accountabilities that are there: the product owner, the Scrum Master, and the developers. Now, there are certain specific things that they are definitely accountable for each. Product owner manages the product backlog, the developers, nearly sort of slips up there, are self-managing. They decide what they're going to do, how to implement the requirements. They're accountable for providing estimates, for example. So there is a certain base layer of accountabilities which is defined by the Scrum framework. For any practical application of Scrum, you would define additional accountabilities, often related to things like HR and line management and who needs to do what in that particular organization. So the idea is that Scrum simply defines the basics and limits itself to those things that are relevant to product delivery in a complex environment. Almost without exception, there are additional accountabilities and responsibilities indeed, which are a consequence of the context of the organization. To put it simply, somebody somewhere is going to be your boss, your line manager, whether you're a Scrum Master or a developer. That's the additional sort of structure that's put in place by your organization. Scrum doesn't try to define that for you, but every organization would have it. Is that the way you guys would see it as well?
Yeah, and I think there was a recent article on the Scrum Inc. Website, which is Jeff Sutherland's company, where they spoke about the Spotify model. And particularly relating that to the Scrum at Scale model that Jeff has. And I think one of the things that highlights in that Spotify model is the matrix management sort of approach, where you still have people had chapter leads, I think they call them, in that model, that are responsible for the direction of the technology. You still have someone that is accountable for the pastoral care of the employees and things like that. And the point of the article is saying how that is compatible with Scrum, rather than saying Spotify has just created something that is unique to themselves.
Good points. Right, okay, so let's just tackle the sort of last section. Once again, there's a couple of questions left in the Q&A, but just to balance out the sort of session. Last section is a bit short, really. It's really just an open question, really. So given that Scrum has been simplified a little bit, given that a lot of the language has been tuned down, does this offer any opportunities? Was there a reason perhaps that you weren't doing Scrum before? Was it because you're not building software, you don't have any testers, you're bored stiff of the daily meetings, you don't like user stories? There are certain things that maybe haven't been relaxed. If you can't get anything ready in 30 days, that actually is still a constraint, and that was always designed to draw your attention to something that you might need to resolve. So I guess it's kind of the sort of last part of the sort of webinar, more open sort of section. What are the opportunities? So in the Q&A, very much encourage you to sort of dive in here as well. Are you, given what you've heard today, is there something you're thinking of doing? Are there any opportunities you think that you might be able to realize now? What do you guys think about that? Or do you sort of spot any teams you've worked with over the years that you think might have it easier now or be able to get involved?
I think there's an opportunity there for some of the product owners that I'm working with at the moment to actually put down that. I'm sure they've got a product goal in mind and they've got that vision, but I'd love to see it formulated a little bit and put down something that they could share with the team, share with the wider audience, like say that elevator pitch for what is this product all about. I think I'd really love to see that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and I think the the focus on just building small increments of things and getting feedback is just so important for dealing with complex situations. And there is no when you're dealing with uncertainty or complexity, whatever it is, whether it's software, marketing, you're kind of teaching a class at school, whatever you're doing, just building something, build a little bit of something, getting feedback, checking that you're building the right thing, and then building a little bit more is just a really great way of managing risk in your projects, and the emphasis on that the new guide brings, I think, is really great. So I think
yeah, good stuff. Good. Okay. Well, we've only got about 5 minutes left, so let's check in with the sort of final questions that we have in the Q&A, and if there are any more questions as well, now's the time. What have we got first up then, Jess?
One of the final questions is, would you recommend using the free questions in the daily stand-up for new teams?
The old classic, what did I do yesterday? What am I going to do today? Do I have any impediments?
Yeah, because those questions have changed quite a few times, haven't they? Because in the early versions of the Scrum Guide, they were exactly as Dunk sort of mentioned them there. But then there was a subtle change in I think it might have been the 2017 edition, where it was to achieve the sprint goal. And so there was an additional sort of subtle wording. And I think when you hear Jeff and Ken, the founders, talk about Scrum, one of the things that they worry about is those three questions have really become almost like a mechanical way of running the daily Scrum, but also a lot of managers are going to the daily Scrums asking those questions and everybody robotically answering them. And what that does is it takes away the accountabilities of the individuals to be talking about the things that really matter, which is how's the sprint going and what do we need to do today in order to achieve it. So I think the questions are still valid, but they're not. It's not an individual question for me. It's a question to the team as a whole. How is the sprint going? What did we do yesterday to achieve the sprint goal? What are we doing today to achieve the sprint goal? And that's not an individual thing. Yesterday I worked on. So I think there is still value in them, but not as a robotic go around the circle and everybody answer the three questions. I think they're more holistic for me.
Yeah, I think they're a perfectly good place to start. So I think the question originally was about if it was a new team or an inexperienced team. I think that was probably their original intent. if the Scrum Guide says, well, every day you've got to get together, you've got to sort of look at the plan. What do we do? What do we say? And if you don't know how to get going, sharing with your colleagues what you did yesterday, telling what you plan to do today, and raising impediments, absolutely fine. Perfectly good way to get going. Trouble is, if the same team is still going through the same 3 questions 5 years into the future, it's probably a sign that something's been held back. So I think absolutely fine. Just because it's no longer in the Scrum Guide doesn't mean you can't ask them. I think it's just the fact that they're no longer in the guide means that you shouldn't feel that you have to stick to them. I think I can see another question, a follow-on question in the Q&A as well. What is instead of the 3 questions? Well, instead of those 3 questions is whatever the developers, whatever the whole Scrum team decides is most useful. So they're sort of sharing information. I think the purpose really is to make sure that people aren't going off in the wrong track. I'm about to work in this bit of the database, and I thought you were, and getting into sort of muddles like that. Sort of letting your colleagues know what you're planning to do, because they might have some ideas or some suggestions, or they might be planning to do something that would mean that maybe it's not such a good idea. So I think the short answer is a good daily Scrum probably evolves into something a little bit less formal, a bit more fluid, right? What's going on today, guys? I was planning on doing this, you're planning on doing that. Great, let's get on with it. And it doesn't have to follow a structure at all. It's just whatever the people that are there think is most useful.
And Duncan, I think you said a good daily Scrum, and that's a nebulous thing, but I would say one of my tests for how good a daily Scrum is how much those team members talk to each other. And that's what I do. That's sometimes with the 3 questions, it's a reporting back to perhaps the Scrum Master, whoever's asked the 3 questions. And I don't see much interaction.
Right. Yes, I see.
Yeah. So I always judge a good daily Scrum by how much the developers are saying, well, I'm planning on doing this today, but I'm going to need some help. And somebody else says, well, I could review that for you, or I could work with that on. And they're actually talking to each other as a team, as you say, to see how they can inspect and adapt their progress to work towards that sprint goal.
Yeah. And I guess the question of whether they have an awareness of how they're getting on. I think one of the most, one of the earliest things that we often sort of work with teams to achieve is the sense during the daily Scrum as to whether the team are checking how they're getting on. We made a plan during sprint planning. We said this is the goal, this is the forecast, this is what we're planning to do. I think the default position is, unless somebody's done something about it, that the focus is just on what am I physically going to do today, without any thought perhaps about, well, are we still on track? Are we likely to complete everything that we told the product owner we were going to complete? If not, what do we need to do? Should we go and talk to them? Should we sort of maybe adjust the scope? So developing that awareness of how we're getting on, that this sort of sense of self-managing is not just about what you do today, it's about managing the plan that you put together and seeing how that evolves and whether or not perhaps it might need to change.
There is one other change in the guide that we haven't mentioned that actually affects the daily Scrum, and that is that the in sprint planning, it suggests that the tasks should be broken down into things that are about a day, smaller than a day in size. And actually that's quite an important change, because what that does is it increases the fidelity of the conversation in the daily Scrum. So rather than, I'm working on ticket 176, talking about the Jira ticket, I'm going to be working on that for the next 6 days. If your things are moving at a rapid pace and you're handing off between different members of the team working on the same product backlog item, then that should be creating a little bit more dialogue about handoffs and interactions or within the sprint.
Good. Do we have any more questions in the Q&A, Jess?
Not question. I think this was a follow-on, but it just not structured, but to shape discussion so that the teams and the PO work together to build the backlog. I believe this was a follow-up question from a previous one.
Yes, I think it's a good observation. I don't remember exactly which question that was a follow-up to, but absolutely, the team and the product owner do absolutely work together to build the backlog. Product owner is accountable for the backlog and the product goal, but of course, they're not going to do all the work. If they do it in isolation, it's going to be a bit of a waste of time.
I think it's probably fair to say that if you're doing anything in isolation in Scrum, then you're probably doing it wrong.
Absolutely.
Just a real quick one in the chat. Mark Kennedy said there's an opportunity here for the Scrum Master to step up, perhaps. Absolutely, Mark. Always is. And just take that opportunity.
Absolutely. I think the Scrum Masters around the world, I think the role of the Scrum Master is sometimes misinterpreted to be the person that organizes the daily Scrum, make sure people turn up, and maybe makes a silly hack retrospective every now and again to keep people motivated. There is so much more to the role than that, and hopefully I think actually one of the biggest sections in the new guide is the section on the Scrum Master. So if you sort of look at the Scrum Master role, there's a lot there. This is not just book the meeting room and get the donuts in. There is quite a bit in there to given that the Scrum Guide has been condensed, there is still quite a bit of accountability for the process, for making it work. And there's a big bit about the way that the Scrum Master works with the organization. It's not just about sort of coaching the teams as well. So yeah, absolutely. There's always a way to be a better Scrum Master.
And that is definitely a change, isn't it? Because in Ken Schwaber's book, he does talk about one of the accountabilities of the Scrum Master is getting the donuts in. So it just goes to show how far we've progressed.
Yeah. Good. Well, thank you for that. Thank you all for joining us. A link should be appearing any moment now in the chat. It's always good to hear how useful or not you found these sessions, and if you want anything else, we can help in any sort of further way. We of course do lots of training courses around Scrum, and there'll be lots of opportunities to get involved with that. And if you'd like any help or advice, more than happy to do any sort of follow-up. It doesn't have to be any sort of paid sort of thing, but if you just wanted a bit of a conversation after this, I'm sure the three of us would be very happy to respond to individual questions or any sort of information that you wanted to hear. But if you wouldn't mind just taking a few moments of your time to follow that link in the chat, let us know what you thought of the session. That would be fantastic. So thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Paul. It's been a good chat, and thank you everybody else for listening. I hope you found it useful, and maybe we'll see you again.
Thanks, everyone.
Cheers.